Welcome to the consultation. My name is Josh Floyd. Here we have Christina Jimenez. We're both attorneys here at Jimenez Floyd Family Law Firm. We've got offices in Dallas, Flower Mound, Louisville, Midland, and Odessa. We're both board certified family law attorneys, a lot of experience under our belt. And today we are
We're
going
old.
experienced. And so today we're going to talk to you about 5 ways that you know you need an experienced divorce attorney. So I'm sure there's more, but today we're just going to do 5.
Yes, yeah. We're trying to keep it simple. So as we say in the beginning, middle, and end of these podcasts, it's so very important that you guys do not accept this as legal advice, right? So this is our opinion about some of these issues. But if you find yourself in a legal situation where you think you might need an attorney, it's important that you find an attorney that's local to your area, right? And if you happen to have a case in one of the areas that Mr. Floyd mentioned, then obviously we're happy to assist you. So I guess first thing that we talked about, Floyd, with regard to the cases where we think that people should hire an experienced divorce attorney, is whenever we're dealing with a complex estate. And I guess let's kind of maybe just back it up a little bit because
You're thinking what I was thinking.
Oh yeah. What are you thinking?
I was thinking, so you always want a good attorney, right? But there's times when you can get away without spending the extra money.
Yeah. Yes. So as Floyd mentioned,
And even if you weren't thinking that, you now took credit.
No, I swear I was about to say that. So as Lloyd was saying, we're both board certified attorneys, okay? And so long story short, after, an attorney passes the bar, they can practice whatever they want to. And then once you've been in a particular field for a certain amount of time, you can then become board certified in the field. We did a separate video on how that works, but it basically is a rigorous process. And once you get your board certification, you are in the top 1% of attorneys practicing, at least in our area, in family law, okay? And so with that, it comes, we're just going to be more costly, right? Because we have the experience, we have the credentials. You do not always need a board certified attorney, right? And it is not oftentimes the wise thing to do if your case is relatively simple, right? Or if you think that you are going to have an agreement. We're not about, making people pay for someone who's, more experience than what they need, right? And so it's important to kind of keep those things in mind. But there are some things that come up, like when I'm doing a consultation, I will tell people, listen, I would love to help you and I'm here to help you, but I don't know that you need somebody with our experience, right? There's other times when I'm talking to somebody where I'm like, listen, you have to have someone with our credentials, with our experience that has dealt with these issues before, because if not, you're going to be in trouble, right? And so now that you stole my thought, was that what you were going to say, Floyd?
I said what I was going to say, and then you said that's what you were going to say.
Okay, do you have anything to add what you were thinking before I actually said it?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I always tell them, if you go and you think you have an agreement, you can get somebody that could do it a lot less expensive. If it falls out and you don't have an agreement, then come back and hire me, because the crap's going to hit the fan, right? And that's when you need us to step in. But
Right.
if you just have an agreement.
And I guess I will say just kind of a word of caution on that. Sometimes, even though you may have an agreement, it can still, another attorney that maybe is not experienced in family law could still potentially, make some big errors that could be costly in the future. And so you kind of just have to be mindful of those things, right? I guess the best advice would be to hire somebody who has experience in family law, even if they're not board certified. Don't go and hire a probate attorney to handle your divorce, because that would be a disaster. But there are certain instances when you have to have, I think, an experienced attorney in family law. And so the first is if we're dealing with a complex estate. And so what do we mean by that?
Yeah, and so this is whether or not you have an agreement, right? If you have complex estate, even if you have an agreement, you want an experienced attorney, because there's lots of little nuances that you have to deal with when you're dealing with complex estate.
Mm-hmm.
So complex estate, we're talking about, multiple real estate properties, stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, various things like that, pension plans, stuff like that, and potentially, if there's been any, within that fraud, waste, hiding of assets, things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's always interesting whenever we're dealing with real property and even, retirement plans, et cetera, and how you have to go about dividing those assets, right? And there's certain things like old liens, right? There's deeds of trust. There's, quadros, qualified domestic relations orders. There's lots of different things that you need to take into consideration when dividing assets, right? If you guys own businesses, if there's, LLCs, if there's shares of stocks that are owned, like all of those things, when you have to start deep diving into those areas, if you don't know what you're doing and if you haven't looked at them before as an attorney, it can really kind of screw things up for people. And so I would say if you kind of fall into any of those categories, like Floyd said, that's why I kind of was backtracking whenever I started talking, because I was like, we've had cases where the parties just owned a home, and they had just agreed that the husband was going to keep the home, and the husband was going to pay the wife $20,000, and then we end up in a situation where 10 years later the wife is saying, I can't get another home because he never got me off the lien, the mortgage. And so we go to the paperwork to see, well, was there a direct order for that to happen? And there wasn't. Right. And so those are the kind of little things that can really trip you up for years and years to come. And those are things that we may not ever be able to remedy. Right. I mean, we can try to step in and do some good lawyering, but sometimes those things you're just stuck with. Right. I typically say if you own like any sort of real property, or if you have like any sort of retirement and stuff, you probably need an experienced family law attorney, even if you guys can be able to work it out.
Right. And if you don't have all that stuff, still hire an attorney to pro se forms. Oh, they're trying to be helpful, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're still going to make a lot of mistakes. I don't know how many times I've seen pro se parties come to me and they drafted their own decree and it's a mess trying to get cleaned up. But another thing I thought about was if there's separate property claims also, right? That makes property a little complex. As far as when property was acquired, when it became community, if it became community, if there was conversion agreements or whatever, which I guess we'll talk about later, right? But so separate property claims makes it also difficult.
Yeah. So I remember I had a case years and years ago where the husband had a pretty decent separate property claim. I was representing wife. And, the burden to prove your separate property is clear and convincing, right? And so it's a very high burden. You have to have all your ducks in a row to be able to establish that. And
How
I
many
was
ducks are there you have to have in a row?
maybe like seven.
7 ducks?
7 ducks. They
Okay.
must all be in
That's
a row.
a lot of ducks in a
And
row.
and so this attorney, unfortunately, just didn't have a whole lot of experience, and I don't know that he understood the code, and I don't know, but he wasn't prepared. And I think the house was valued at like $250,000, and it really should have gone to husband, but because he could not meet his burden, they lost that, right? And so that was a big, big chunk of money. And I understand that hiring an experienced board certified attorney, like our firm, it costs a lot, but that's how much it can cost you if your attorney doesn't know what they're doing. Right. And so just kind of things to think about when you're making this decision. Anything else on the complex estate?
I don't think so. I mean, with separate property stuff, you have reimbursement claims potentially, right? Which can be very complicated, particularly with the new statute, right? That changed everything that we've been doing for 15 years or whatever, 10 years. So, and it's more than just what's in the family code, which, experienced attorneys know the codes outside of just the family code because there's more codes you have to look at with the property codes and things like that. And so if you get somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, that's relying strictly on the statutes set out in the family code for division of property, they don't know the adverse, tax consequences, other property consequences, and things like that that also have to be dealt with. You're going to find yourself in a pickle if one of those ducks is drifted off.
Yeah, if there's only 6 ducks, you're
Right,
in
that's going to be a
trouble.
problem.
So the next is custody disputes, right? And so, here at Jimenez Floyd, we deal a lot with custody disputes. And it mostly will revolve around who has the exclusive right to designate the primary residence, right? So where do the children primarily live? It'll mostly revolve around possession and access, right? But sometimes we have issues on, rights and duties, right? Like who's making decisions? Do we have certain people that shouldn't be around the children? Do we have drug history, alcohol abuse? All of those things that if you haven't tried millions of cases, like we have, I think that's an exaggeration, but
it may not be.
Like
trials total, maybe, right? Cases I don't know about.
But it's important that your attorney knows how to handle that, right? So
so custody disputes, I think this is one of the places that a lot of people waste a lot of money, right? Because I would say 30% maybe are justified, right? Mm-hmm. The rest of them are just people in their emotions, pissed off, and, unfortunately the kids suffer from it. But if you're not the one causing the problem, you still have to fight the fight. Right. And that's what I tell the clients that when during consultations, I'm like, look, I mean, we can only control our side. And if they're going to be unreasonable and start making these moves, we have to make moves. We have to make counterattacks. We have to fight it. Otherwise, you're just going to stand there in the ring and get your butt kicked. So, when it comes down to custody stuff, sex offenders around the kids, if there's been family violence and you have legitimate concerns, absolutely. Or if the other party's making false accusations against you, and you've got to go defend those. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. And if you don't have an experienced attorney to represent you, you're going to have trouble lining up the ducks.
Well, and so, here's what I'll say is, and I was just having this conversation with a client, I think a couple days ago, because there's all these concerns, right? There's all of these allegations, and I tell them, listen, I understand that what you're telling me is... I understand that what you're telling me. Can you stop?
Yeah. I just made a note. That's all I did.
So,
I'm just proposing we eat some rubber ducks.
Getting rubber ducks for the podcast, Floyd. But what I was explaining to her is, listen, it doesn't matter, like, honestly, in the context of litigation, what actually happened, right? Or what we know. And this is so unfortunate. And I hate having these conversations with people, but it's not what the reality is. It's what we can prove when we step into that courtroom. Right. And so a lot of times you can say, okay, well, the father's a drunk and he puts my children in danger all the time. But we don't have the videos or the messages or the recordings or the witnesses. We don't have anything. Right. And those are the types of things that when you get with an experienced divorce attorney or child custody attorney, we know how to potentially pull that evidence out, right? And especially in the context of a courtroom, if you get somebody who's not in that courtroom like every day the way that we are, and they don't know how to introduce evidence or exclude evidence, you're going to be in trouble when it comes to those sort of situations in the context of a custody dispute.
Yeah, and the evidence you're talking about, it's important, right? Because, I mean, this is the courtroom of lies, right? This is... People get on the stand and lie all the time. I was in court earlier this week, and the bailiff made a joke about needing fire retardant on the witness stand, right? So that when someone got struck down, it didn't catch the entire courtroom on fire. And I was like, that's great. Yeah, they lie all the time, right? And you have to have experienced attorneys to come in and be able to establish that they are lying.
Right.
Right. Otherwise, it's a he said, she said, right? And the judge doesn't know what to believe. And it's whoever's more credible. And just based on the fact that you may be more nervous or something like that, you may come off as less credible, even though you're telling the truth. So we've got to get that evidence so we can prove that what the other person is saying is not correct or whatever we need to do. So that's a very important part.
Or what you're saying is correct, right? Because a lot of times we have that where, there's a story and it's a far-fetched story, but we have heard lots of far-fetched stories that actually occurred.
That we didn't believe at first.
Like, no. And they were like, oh, no, it is true. But we have to be able to establish those things, right? And so I would say, like, if you guys are pretty solid and y'all co-parent well and y'all have, a custody arrangement, like a visitation schedule that works, and we agree that grandpa's crazy and grandpa doesn't need to be around the kiddos, like those sort of things, you can probably get an attorney who does family law, maybe not board certified, that can help you guys facilitate that, right? But if we start getting into these more complicated issues, you have to have somebody who knows how to work these cases up.
If you want to win.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next is pre and post marital agreements.
Yeah, those are fun. So pre and post marital agreements, basically a premarital agreement is an agreement before the marriage.
Pre-marriage.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the
What's
term?
post marital? What is that?
That's in the middle. It's really weird because it's not after the marriage; it's during the marriage. But it's after you're married.
After, yeah.
It's after you're married, but during the marriage.
Just go,
right?
Floyd. What were you going to say?
So what's the term that most people use for a premarital agreement?
Prenuptial.
Prenuptial agreement, yes. Mm-hmm. So that's what that is. Basically, you just go in and decide that no matter what happens, what we purchased during the marriage, this is going to remain my separate property. This we're going to deal with spousal support or whatever. You have your agreement for the divorce before you're actually married. Mm-hmm. And so those can be complicated if they're not drafted correctly. Depending on which side you want to be on, right? Whether we're going to try to enforce them or just kick them out. But they can be complicated. Post-marital agreements, conversion agreements is what they're called. And yeah, also there's lots of requirements for them. And so it can be complicated. It can make things very difficult, whether you're trying to enforce them or get them kicked out.
Yeah, so I had a client call a couple of months back, and he's been a client for years and years. And we helped him with his divorce. We won custody of his kiddo. And he calls me like on a Wednesday, and he's like, "Hey, Christina, I think I'm going to go to, we're going to Mexico this weekend, and we're going to get married, and I need you to draft a prenuptial agreement." And I was like, it don't work like that, man. Like, you might have to pump the brakes on this wedding. I hope y'all didn't send out invites because it's not going to happen. So it takes time, right? And like Floyd was saying, like there's lots of processes that have to be followed, lots of rules, very hyper technical. And if they're not followed, then you potentially have problems. And in that particular case, he was the money earning spouse, and we needed to make sure that if we're going to go down this path, he was well protected. And so they didn't get married. I don't know if they're still together. So I probably need to call him now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, so if you are in that situation and you think you might need one of these agreements, and make sure you hire somebody that's experienced in that area.
Or if you've signed one and you're going through a divorce.
Yeah, we've had that happen too. And we've had to try to set those things aside before. And so a lot of times what I've seen is, you'll take a postmarital agreement or a conversion agreement to an attorney, and they'll look at it and they'll say, "Oh, well, you signed it, and so now you're screwed. You get nothing." And it's like, hold on, wait a minute. Let's look at the technicalities of this. And is it truly enforceable? Are we really, really that bad off? Or is there an argument that could potentially be made?
Yeah, okay. Those can be incredibly complex because not only do you have the statute today that has requirements, but you have to look at the statute when it was drafted. What were the requirements then? And then if it was in a different state when you signed that, what were their requirements and which one trumps that state or this state based on when it was signed and how it was signed? So those can get very, very complex.
Right. So the next one is the UCCJEA. I guess we should have added UIFSA. And any other just kind of jurisdictional issues when you have those issues.
Yeah, so jurisdiction just basically deals with a state or a county's ability to hear a certain case, right? Do they have jurisdiction over the matter? In divorce cases in Texas, if you lived in Texas for 6 months and in that county for 90 days, they can hear it. For child custody cases, the child, generally speaking, is the last place the child resided for 6 months. And sometimes the divorce and the child custody case can be in two different states, depending on how things are going. But the general rule in Texas, right, is the child custody case goes into the divorce case, but UCCJEA trumps that, and sometimes they have to be different. So those are very complex, convoluted rules, particularly when you're dealing with the UCCJEA, UFSA, that kind of stuff. And so you may have some jurisdictional matters on your hands. If you file certain pleadings, you may be waiving those arguments. So those types of cases, if you're not both living in the same county, same state, whatever, absolutely, you've got to have an experienced attorney to come in and handle that.
Yeah, and I'd say, it's most relevant when you're dealing with kiddos. If it's just a divorce and, your wife moves to, I don't know, Alaska, and she files and y'all have some property, and may not be that big of an issue, I guess, from a travel perspective, for you to go to the hearings, that might be an issue. But where we see it a lot and where I feel like it's worth the fight is when I have, a dad who absconds to a completely other state and then immediately files in that state, even though the children had been living, in Midland County or in Ector County, in one of our, where we practice, for 10 years, right? And they go and they try to get jurisdiction in that particular area because I know we had one where she filed in the county where her father was like the county judge and her mother had been like the principal of the elementary, so had good roots in this county, probably knew everyone in that county. And so mom wanted to establish jurisdiction there, and we had to say, pump the brakes, we're not going to submit to that jurisdiction, we're bringing it back here to, I think that one was in Denton County, where this case belongs, right? And it can, unfortunately, result, and I don't know that it's like this everywhere, but a lot of the judges, if the kids are in their county, they prefer that the kiddos stay in their county. And I don't know, why that is, but it sometimes happens that way, right? And so they're like, okay, kiddos have moved to this, different county that they've never lived in. We're going to leave the kiddos here. And now, Dad, you're stuck with visitation, all because you didn't make the jurisdictional argument that, hey, this case should have been in Denton County, and a Denton County judge says these kids are coming back to Denton County, right? So just something to think about. The UCCJEA, that's the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, I think.
Perfect. Good work.
Thank you. That deals with interstate issues, right? So you have a person who absconds to a different state, or they file in a different state, and then the courts kind of have to figure out who has jurisdiction over these kiddos, right? UFSA is the Uniform Interstate Financial Support Act, and that deals with support issues, right? And so, those are other issues that can get very complicated. If you don't have an attorney who understands those, they can potentially consent to a modification of support that may not be warranted, right? And so just lots of things that you have to think about if you're dealing with interstate issues, right? So filing in another state, or filing in Texas when it originated out of another state, you got to have somebody who knows how to deal with those.
You could very well have a situation where you have a divorce in Dallas County, the child custody case up in Nevada, but because Nevada doesn't have personal jurisdiction over dad, we have child support case in Dallas County, and Nevada just deals with conservatorship, possession, and access. And so it can be very, very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we had a case a few months back where they had a divorce out of, I'm not going to say the state, I'll make up a state. They had the divorce out of California. And that
California's a real state. You don't have to make that up. That's a real state.
Not the real state where they actually originated from.
Oh, okay.
And so
I thought you were going to make up a state.
And so they had orders for spousal support. And in Texas, they filed a modification of conservatorship and possession and access, etc. And that attorney was like, oh, and we're going to also modify spousal support here in Texas. And I don't know, but I think that maybe another attorney who didn't have my experience may have said, oh, okay, yeah, we got to discuss this and it needs to be an issue. And I was like, yeah, we're not doing that. Like, he's on the hook for, I think it was like $4,000 a month. He's going to be paying $4,000 a month unless he goes to California and he deals with that. So just little things like that you got to be mindful of. And then the last thing we had, number 5, is enforcements.
Yeah, enforcements can be difficult just because of the burden, right? So enforcements, they call them quasi-criminal, right? Because it does have potential jail time as a punishment. And so it's treated a lot like a criminal case, but then also civilly, right? So your burden is beyond a reasonable doubt, just like it would be in a criminal trial. You have all the due process and constitutional protections and notice requirements and all of that. And so, much like pre and post marital agreements, it's one of those things that has to be pled correctly to ensure notice is given properly, and that, depending on the enforcement, there's different elements that are required to make sure that the respondent has adequate notice under their due process rights. And the deal with enforcement is if it's screwed up, right, you get one shot at it, right? You go to that hearing and it's wrong, you're barred from ever bringing that because it's been barred by double jeopardy under the criminal statutes. Mm-hmm. So those have to be pled correctly. Those have to be taken care of very, very carefully and by somebody experienced that knows what they're doing. I don't know how many enforcements we've gotten kicked out from attorneys not drafting them correctly. And we show up and we're like, all right, let's just have a hearing. And then we're having to explain double jeopardy to the judge.
And I get like super paranoid whenever I'm approving enforcement. And so I'll go through and I'll approve it and I'll call Floyd like, hey, can you look at this one more time for me? Because I don't want that to happen to me because I've done it to other people before, right? And the thing is that it's not just about the technicality of the pleadings. It is also about proving up the allegations, right? And so I think that sometimes attorneys that are less experienced think that, oh, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to have my client testify to this particular issue. And then that's going to be enough. And sometimes it can be, but we always try to really make sure, like, here, this is our burden beyond a reasonable doubt. Let me make sure, Judge, that you have all of this evidence that you need. And depending on the situation, right? So if our client is really wanting jail time, we're going to make sure that we have strategized that case and we have gathered all the evidence and we have worked it up so that when the judge hears this, the judge is so upset and appalled by that other party's behavior that they do put them in jail, right? Because I think most judges don't like putting people in jail on enforcement.
I agree.
They try to give them a chance, as if it's their first, maybe even their second,
unless
chance.
It's really egregious.
Unless it's very egregious, right? And so, but if you don't have the evidence, if you don't, prove it up the way that you need to, then you might not get the relief that you need. And if you don't do that, well, then you kind of done a disservice. So
I think a lot of the less experienced attorneys, they kind of fall into the rut of, the clear and convincing burden, the best interest burden, the burden that they have every day in all of their trials, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't click with them that when you go to an enforcement, right, your burden's now beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest burden in the United States, right? And so you have to shift your thinking and your trial strategies to be able to meet that burden. Just your burden that you fight for day to day is not going to be sufficient on an enforcement. And so you've got to be able to shift that, make sure you have enough evidence to meet that burden to be successful.
Right. And I will tell you that the reason why we know all of this stuff is because we have made these mistakes in the past, right? We had to learn these lessons the hard way, and those are they're not fun when that happens, right? But the good thing is when it did happen many moons ago, we learned the lesson, we improved, we continued to work on our skills and to push one another.
How do you feel about calling the opposing party in an enforcement?
What do you mean?
Sarabia knows.
No, why did you do that? Every time you do this, you boost his ego. Now, Daniel, hello. So that was your first enforcement
hearing? It was, yep.
Ever. So, but we learned a lesson there. Both of us did.
Still 13 years later.
We don't forget it. And so you don't, depending on your situation, right? But I would say most people don't want to have to experience those sort of issues, right? And so hire somebody who practices family law, pretty regularly. Don't go and hire your cousin who, just got his bar license. And if you find yourself in one of these categories, then please try to find somebody who is board certified, who has many moons of experience, because I think that you're going to get, there's more value, right? And I understand that typically we're going to be on the higher end of the cost, right? But what you stand to gain and what you potentially stand to lose, it I think in some cases will surpass what you are having to pay for our services, right? And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind and, consult with a bunch of different attorneys. I tell people that all the time. Like, listen, I may not be your cup of tea. That's cool. Go and talk to somebody who you feel is going to have your back, who's going to take care of you. Because at the end of the day, you got to have that trust with whoever it is that you hire.
I concur.
So, as always, thank you guys for watching the consultation. We are the attorneys at Jimenez Floyd. As Mr. Floyd indicated, we have offices in Odessa, Midland, Louisville, Flower Mound, and Dallas. And if you guys need anything in any of those areas, please feel free to reach out to us. Do not take this as any sort of legal advice, and make sure that you follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube. Anywhere you can find anybody, we're going to be there.